Until 300 years ago, the way in which people in England worshipped was a matter for the state. People who refused to accept the authority of the Church of England could be fined, imprisoned, or even tortured. Dissenters weren't tolerated.
We hired a house for a public meeting place, and in the night time the scholars threw stones and dirt against the windows and broke the windows very much. They shot bullets into the chambers at us and flung great stones.
In our meeting house, the soldiers came and set upon us with swords and brake the windows and doors in pieces and fell upon us and beat and wounded many of the friends.
The meeting was broken up by soldiers beating, kicking and hurling people onto heaps, just pushing them with the ends of their muskets.
They were so resolute and gloried in their constancy and sufferings that they assembled openly and were dragged away daily to the common jail, so that the jail at Newgate was filled with them. Abundance of them died in prison, and yet they continued their assembly still.
Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land.
300 years ago, in 1689, Parliament passed the Act of Toleration. For the first time, most Protestant nonconformists were allowed to worship in their own chapels. Nonconformist means exactly what it says, a person who did not conform or belong. In this case, someone who did not accept the rules of the nationally established church, the Church of England. People like those here at Knutsford in Cheshire.
We built this chapel to celebrate this new freedom. We of scrupulous conscience in religion, we Protestant descendants from the Church of England, we built our chapels in faith. We prayed for peace and settled times.
We gathered to hear the preaching of God in our own building.
We gathered to take communion without fear.
We opened our chapel doors in hope and in joy.
The Unitarians, commemorating the Act of Toleration in Knutsford Chapel, are just one branch of nonconformity. There are many others. And as this is a film about the buildings of Protestant descent, let's take a look at a typical small northern English town, Otley, in Yorkshire, and see the range of chapels there were, and in many cases still are. Here, in a town with just the one parish church, there have been at different times Quaker, Congregational, Wesleyan Methodist, Methodist New Connection, Wesleyan Reform Mission, Primitive Methodist, Salvation Army, and a Kingdom Hall of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And all this is in one small town. And the buildings varied a great deal too. There were chapels alongside the homes of Puritan squires, experimental octagons, chapels in town, and in the country, the domestic simplicity of Methodist preaching boxes.
In this film, we ask, what do chapels and meeting houses look like? How do we study their archaeology? How were they used for worship? And how did they fit into the human and industrial landscapes of villages and towns? We can study the forms of meeting houses and chapels which survive in our cities, towns and villages. This chapel at Knutsford was built around the time of the passing of the Act of Toleration in 1689.
The first users of this chapel were nonconformists called Presbyterians, and it was built more like a house than a medieval church. Its basic shape and features, such as windows and doors, look domestic. Like a number of chapels in this region, it's built all of brick and in 2 stories. The external staircases gave the only access to the gallery, even in winter.
The galleries provided extra seating. They were placed so that everyone could see the pulpit, where I am. For most nonconformists, the sermon was an important part of worship, so it was essential that every member of the congregation could see and hear the preacher. The layout of the interior is a rectangle with the pulpit placed along the centre of this long wall. The Presbyterians arranged their pews differently from the Church of England. An area in front of the pulpit was left empty. Here, where the font now stands, long tables would have been set up. The congregation sat around these tables to receive their communion. We can understand a little better what is nonconformist about this chapel by looking at a Church of England building of about the same date.
In remote parts of England, extra places of worship were built for those who found it difficult to get to their parish church. These were called chapels of ease, because they made it easier for members of the Church of England to worship.
This is Jenkin Chapel, a Church of England chapel of ease which stands alone now in a fold of the Pennines, not far from Knutsford. It was built slightly later than the nonconformist chapel, probably about half a lifetime, and in some ways it's similar. See the external staircase. It's more like a local farmhouse, though. See the windows, the flag roof, the chimney stack. And in other ways, it's characteristic of a Church of England building. Its tower, its chancel for the altar, and the whole building points east. Jenkin Chapel has some features in common with a nonconformist building of the same date, but inside it is arranged for the worship of the Church of England.
The internal fittings are arranged along the long axis of the building, with the chancel as the main focus of attention. The pews and the single gallery face the chancel. The pulpit is placed off-centre at one side, and like the chapel at Knutsford, the pulpit here has windows nearby to light it. And there are plaques and memorials to people who worshipped and are buried here. But despite some oddities, Jenkin Chapel is still typical of a Church of England building. Nonconformist chapels, however, varied considerably amongst themselves. Here's another nonconformist building, Goodshaw Chapel in Lancashire, begun in 1760.
Originally, a main road passed by the chapel, but as other settlements developed, a second chapel was built in a more convenient location. For a long time now, services have been held at Goodshaw only about once a year. Its congregation has moved on, but for the chapel, time has stood still.
An archaeologist can write a history of this building, not just by digging it up, but also by looking at its standing masonry, its stages of construction.
Like many chapels, only the main front or facade at Goodshaw is decorative. This is its public face. Its sash windows and doors are plain, rather like those of local houses. In other ways, Goodshaw is typical of chapel architecture. Take, for instance, the pair of central windows. They flank a space for the pulpit inside. Inside Goodshaw Chapel, many of the fixtures and fittings remain from the time of its enlargement in about 1800. The pulpit is raised and central so that all could see and hear the preacher.
At present, the pulpit is masked by scaffolding while the chapel is being repaired.
In those days, the singing had great attractions. As old Mr. Pilling used to say to the singers, "You can get the people together by your singing, so I have the chance to talk to them."
The singers sat in a pew in front of the pulpit, and the orchestra was in the space in front of that. During its life, as the congregation increased, the building grew with it.
We can see the original line of the roof and the frontage, which at some time was extended forward to make a larger building. Access to the galleries was through this blocked doorway. We can still see traces of the stairways that led to the door.
That is the east wall. The west wall shows even more obvious signs of change.
This wall tells us something different. At the ground floor, we can see a blocked doorway, and there are signs of a chimney back and chimney breast. It seems that this wall was a joining wall between the chapel and a second building which projected forward towards us.
The second building, which was the minister's house, has since been knocked down, but not before it had been extended again by the addition of a schoolroom which lined up with the front of the chapel, as you can see in this drawing of about 1880. The doorway at the bottom led through directly into the chapel. The minister didn't get wet, even in winter.
Goodshot Chapel is being repaired, so people in the future will be able to see how people in the past worshipped.
On a fine evening in summer, the singing at the Baptist chapel has been heard at Cribden Gill, 2 miles away across the valley. Certainly, they used to make a great song.
At Knutsford and Goodshaw, we've seen the importance of the sermon, the taking of communion, and latterly of music in nonconformist worship. But did all groups worship in the same way? One of the earliest nonconformist denominations, one which is still active today, is the Society of Friends, or Quakers. And the Friends use their buildings in rather a different way. This 17th century example at Crawshaw Booth, near Goodshaw, is typical of a Friends meeting house.
The principles of the Friends, equality and simplicity, can be seen in their architecture and in their gravestones, which are all the same size. Friends meetings take place in silence, broken only by speech when the Spirit moves someone to talk. Inside, there's no pulpit, there's no communion, no music, just the silence. On the benches, there are Bibles, but no prayer books. The benches face the stand where the ministers, overseers and elders used to sit. At Wilmslow in Cheshire is a more spacious Georgian meeting house, but the principles remain the same. Bibles on the benches and silence. Within the main meeting house was a separate women's meeting room. At Wilmslow, 2 removable partition walls form a passageway between the men's and women's rooms. Women were felt to have different priorities, such as concern for the relief of the poor, and until well into the 19th century they had a separate business meeting. Nowadays, this room is used as a Sunday school.
Not all nonconformists were closed groups like the Quakers. The types of people joining a denomination depended on the time and place in which they lived.
The 18th and 19th centuries saw great changes in the north of England. Industrialization, people working in towns. In towns such as York, the railway brought population growth, and districts within the town became strongholds of prosperous nonconformity. The 1780 Methodist Conference warned,
"Let all preaching houses be built plain and decent, but not more expensive than is absolutely unavoidable. Otherwise, the necessity of raising money will make rich men necessary to us, and then farewell to Methodist discipline."
Yet in St. Saviour Gate there were 3 large chapels built on the one street. There was the Salem Congregational Chapel, completed in 1839, which has now been demolished and replaced by this building. Then there was the original Presbyterian Chapel of 1693, now Unitarian, built very shortly after the Act of Toleration. And thirdly, there was the Methodist Centenary Chapel, now known as the Central Methodist Church, on the right, down at the far end.
The 19th century saw massive growth in the numbers of nonconformists. They chose to parade their growing popularity with imposing urban chapels. York's Wesleyan Methodist Chapel at St. Saviour Gate was built to commemorate the first 100 years of Methodism. It cost £8,000 to build, and that was a lot of money in the 1830s. In its magnificent display, Centenary Chapel reflected the way in which Victorian nonconformists had become top people in many towns. Centenary is a cathedral of Methodism. Inside it is a cavernous rectangle with a central pulpit of Spanish mahogany and music provided by this impressive organ. Classical capitals support a vast gallery. In all, 1,500 worshippers could be seated below Centenary's richly plastered ceiling. This was a far cry from the first Methodists who preached outdoors, or slightly later when they built chapels that were simply designed and plainly furnished. But not all nonconformists built on this scale. The primitive Methodists, for example, rejected all of this grandeur.
At first, they built no chapels at all.
Our chapels were the coal pits or any other place. And in our conversation way, we preach the gospel to all, good or bad, rough or smooth.
Later, they did build simple preaching houses. The primitives appealed to unskilled workers in rural and industrial villages. Their preachers, stern men and women, became known as ranters.
Brothers and sisters, beware! Take heed of my warning. You are sinking in sin. You are mired in a morass of iniquity. The very minions of Satan are even now trying to drag you down to the depths of perdition.
Over the last 3 centuries, tens of thousands of chapels were built. Today, there are fewer chapel goers than there once were, and not all the chapels are now needed for worship. In places, the preaching that began in houses is now silent. The chapels are returning to be barns, workshops, garages, flats, and houses again. Some have disappeared altogether and are remembered only in the name of a street. Nonconformist chapels are a reflection of their age and of ours.
Even the plainest chapels tell us something from their form, furnishings, and position. Buildings are more than just shelter from the rain. They tell us something about people in the past, people who built and used chapels, their beliefs and their ideas.
Continued their assembly still.
Years ago, in 1689, Parliament passed the Act of Toleration. For the first time, most Protestant nonconformists were allowed to worship in their own chapels. Nonconformist means exactly what it says, a person who did not conform or belong. In this case, someone who did not accept the rules of the nationally established church, the Church of England. People like those here at Knutsford in Cheshire.
We built this chapel to celebrate this new freedom. We of scrupulous conscience in religion, we Protestant descenders from the Church of England, we built our chapels in faith. We prayed for peace and settled times.
We gathered to hear the preaching of God in our own building.
We gathered to take communion without fear.
We opened our chapel doors in hope and in joy.
The Unitarians, commemorating the Act of Toleration in Knutsford Chapel, are just one branch of nonconformity. There are many others. And as this is a film about the buildings of Protestant descent, let's take a look at a typical small northern English town, Otley, in Yorkshire, and see the range of chapels there were, and in many cases still are. Here, in a town with just the one parish church, there have been at different times Quaker, Congregational, Wesleyan Methodist, Methodist New Connection, Wesleyan Reform Mission, Primitive Methodist, Salvation Army, and a Kingdom Hall of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Until 300 years ago, the way in which people in England worshipped was a matter for the state. People who refused to accept the authority of the Church of England could be fined, imprisoned, or even tortured. Dissenters weren't tolerated.
We hired a house for a public meeting place, and in the night time the scholars threw stones and dirt against the windows and broke the windows very much. They shot bullets into the chambers at us and flung great stones.
In our meeting house, the soldiers came and set upon us with swords and brake the windows and doors in pieces and fell upon us and beat and wounded many of the friends.
The meeting was broken up by soldiers beating, kicking and hurling people onto heaps, just pushing them with the ends of their muskets.
They were so resolute and gloried in their constancy and sufferings that they assembled openly and were dragged away daily to the common jail, so that the jail at Newgate was filled with them. Abundance of them died in prison, and yet they